The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people shuffled into their seats, the weight of the pending case heavy in the air. At the center of it all, Judge Raymond Carter leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the desk impatiently. He was a man who prided himself on control, sharp, commanding, and unyielding. To him, the law was black and white, with no room for gray areas, and today, he was already irritated. "Next case," he barked, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. The bailiff called out a name and a woman stepped forward. She was poised, elegant, dressed in a sleek navy blue suit. But to Judge Carter, none of that mattered. He barely glanced at her, noting only that she was a black woman, another defendant. Most likely, someone who had probably made poor choices and was now wasting his time. He sighed dramatically. "State your name and your business," he said, his tone dismissive. The woman didn't flinch. She met his gaze with calm confidence, the kind that unnerved men like him. She was used to moments like these, where people judged her before she even opened her mouth. She had learned long ago to let them dig their own graves. "My name is Justice Elaine Mitchell," she said smoothly, her voice ringing with quiet authority, "and I am here to observe today's proceedings." A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Carter frowned, the name tickling something in the back of his mind. It was familiar, but he couldn't place it. He waved a hand, unimpressed. "We don't have time for observers. If you're not involved in this case, I suggest you take a seat." Still, she remained standing, her expression unreadable. The attorneys and clerks exchanged looks, some of them already aware of who she was. A reporter in the back leaned forward, sensing a story unfolding in real time. "Your Honor," one of the lawyers finally spoke up hesitantly. "Perhaps you—" Judge Carter held up a hand, silencing him. "I don't need advice on how to run my courtroom," he snapped. His patience was running thin. Who did this woman think she was, walking in as if she owned the place? Then, just as he was about to order her out, the realization hit him like a freight train. His mouth went dry. His fingers, which had been tapping in annoyance, stilled completely. Elaine Mitchell, the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the most powerful judge in the entire country, and he had just scorned her in his own courtroom. Meanwhile, miles away in a crowded subway, a teenage boy named Jordan adjusted his backpack and glanced around at the packed train car. It was the usual afternoon rush. Businessmen scrolling through, their phones, mothers clutching their children's hands, teenagers lost in their music. He sighed, shifting his weight. Just another regular day. Then he saw her, a pregnant woman struggling to hold onto the rail as the train jerked forward. Her face was pale, exhausted. Jordan didn't think twice. He stood up, motioning for her to take his seat. She hesitated for a moment before offering a grateful smile. "Thank you, young man," she said, easing down onto the seat. "No problem," Jordan replied, returning to his music. He wasn't expecting anything in return. His mom had raised him to be respectful, to help when he could. It was just the right thing to do. But a few minutes later, as the train approached her stop, the woman reached into her bag, pulled out a small folded note, and slipped it into his hand. "Read this when you get home," she whispered before stepping off. Jordan watched her disappear into the crowd, the slip of paper now warm in his palm. He frowned, his heartbeat quickening slightly. What could possibly be in this note? As the train rumbled forward, he had no idea that what was written inside would change his life forever. The subway ride home felt longer than usual for Jordan. He kept rolling the small note between his fingers, feeling its weight despite how light it was. It was just paper, but something about the way the woman had given it to him made it feel like more. He had seen the look in her eyes, something deeper than just gratitude. It was like she knew something he didn't. He glanced around at the other passengers, wondering if any of them noticed his nervous energy. No one paid him any attention. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. But Jordan knew that, for some reason, his world had just shifted in a way he didn't yet understand. As soon as he got home, he tossed his backpack onto the couch and unfolded the note with careful fingers. His heart pounded as he read the words written in neat, careful handwriting. "You remind me of someone I lost a long time ago. You have no idea how much your kindness means to me. Please call this number. I want to help you." At the bottom was a phone number written clearly, no name, no explanation, just a simple request. Jordan swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to make of it. He had done something small. Offering a seat wasn't a big deal, but something about this felt bigger. It felt like more than just a thank you. But why? He thought about telling his mom, but she was still at work. He thought about asking his best friend Malik, but he already knew what he'd say. Man, don't call that number. It could be some weird scam or something. Jordan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the note. He wasn't reckless, but something about this felt important. He took a deep breath, grabbed his phone, and dialed the number. It rang twice before a voice answered. A woman's voice, warm and steady. "I was hoping you'd call," she said. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Carter sat frozen at his bench. The realization of his mistake sank deeper with every passing second. He had dismissed her, dismissed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as if she were nobody. The silence in the courtroom stretched, the weight of it pressing down on him. Elaine Mitchell still stood in front of him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't angry. She was just waiting. For the first time in his long career, Judge Carter felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Not frustration, not arrogance, fear. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Justice Mitchell," he said, forcing a tight smile. But she lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence, the same way he had silenced others before. "I believe you were about to remove me from your courtroom," she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through stone. The reporters in the back scribbled furiously, their eyes wide with interest. The attorneys exchanged nervous glances. They all knew what was happening here. I wasn't aware," Judge Carter stammered. His face was red now, beads of sweat forming at his temple. Elaine tilted her head slightly. That much was clear. She turned slowly, glancing around the courtroom. "This is a place where justice is supposed to be blind. But today I watched as you dismissed me without knowing a thing about who I was. And I have to ask myself, how many others have you dismissed the same way?" The question hung in the air. Judge Carter opened his mouth, but no words came. Elaine let the silence stretch before she finally spoke again. "I'll be watching," she said, her voice soft but carrying enough weight to make the room feel smaller. Then she turned and walked out, leaving behind only the sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor. The courtroom doors swung shut behind her, and for the first time in his life, Judge Carter realized what it felt like to be the one. After judgment, back in his room, Jordan gripped his phone tightly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice coming out quieter than he intended. The woman on the other end of the line sighed as if trying to decide how much to say. "My name is Margaret Holloway," she finally said, "and before we go any further, I want you to know that this isn't some trick. I don't want anything from you, I saw something in you today." Jordan frowned. "But why give me your number?" There was a pause. Then she said, "Because I think I can change your life." The word sent a chill down Jordan's spine. He didn't know this woman, didn't know if he could trust her, but something about the way she spoke made it impossible to ignore. Margaret continued, "I had a son. His name was Daniel. He was about your age when I lost him." Jordan's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. He was kind, just like you, she went on. He always thought of others before himself, and he would have done exactly what you did today, stand up and offer his seat without a second thought. Jordan shifted, feeling a lump in his chest. I'm sorry for your loss." Margaret's voice softened. "Thank you. It's been many years, but losing a child never stops hurting." Jordan swallowed. He couldn't imagine that kind of pain. "I don't want to make this about my grief," Margaret continued. "I want to make this about you. You see, my son had big dreams. He wanted to go to college, to do something meaningful with his life, and I was lucky enough to be in a position where I could support him." Jordan's heartbeat quickened. He had dreams too. He wanted to go to college, but money had always been tight. His mom worked hard, but every bill was a struggle. He had accepted a long time ago that he might have to put his dreams on hold. Margaret took a deep breath. "Jordan, I'd like to help you." His eyes widened. "Help me? How?" "I have a scholarship fund in my son's name," she said. "Every year I try to find someone who reminds me of him, someone with a good heart, someone with potential. And when I saw you today, I just knew." Jordan couldn't believe what he was hearing. His hands trembled. "You mean you'd pay for my college?" Margaret chuckled softly. "I'd like to, but I don't want you to say yes right away. I want you to think about it. Talk to your mom. Make sure this is something you truly want." Jordan could barely speak. His whole world felt like it had just shifted again, but this time it was even bigger than before. I don't know what to say," he admitted. Margaret's voice was warm. "Then don't say anything yet. Just promise me you'll think about it." Jordan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Okay," he whispered. As he hung up, he sat there in silence, staring at the note in his hand. A few hours ago, it had just been a small slip of paper. Now it was the key to something he never imagined possible. And for the first time in a long time, he dared to hope. Jordan barely slept that night. The note sat on his nightstand. The words burned into his mind. He had never expected his simple act of kindness to lead to something like this. A scholarship, a chance at college. It didn't feel real. He had always believed that opportunities like these didn't just fall into people's laps, especially not people like him. The next morning, he sat across from his mom at the small kitchen table, the note in his hand. She was still in her work uniform, sipping coffee, the exhaustion from her overnight shift written all over her face. "I don't know, Jordan," she said after he explained everything. "This just seems unusual." "I know," he admitted, but she sounded real. "She told me to think about it first. She didn't pressure me or anything." His mom studied him, her tired eyes filled with concern. "And you're sure this isn't some kind of scam?" Jordan nodded. "She didn't ask for anything. She just said she wanted to help." His mom exhaled slowly. "I don't want you getting your hopes up, baby. People don't just offer things like this without a reason." "That's what I keep asking myself too," Jordan said. "But maybe she just wants to help because she can." She was quiet for a long moment. Jordan could see the hesitation in her face. She had spent years protecting him, making sure he didn't get caught up in anything that could hurt him. Finally, she reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "If you really want to meet her, I want to come with you." Jordan felt relief wash over him. "Yeah, I think that's a good idea." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Judge Carter sat in his office staring at the newspaper on his desk. His name was all over it. Judge Carter disrespects new Chief Justice in his own courtroom. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of his actions crushing down on him. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the kind of mistake that ruined careers. He had spent years building his reputation, priding himself on being a respected figure in the legal system. And now, in a matter of minutes, he had become a national embarrassment. The phone on his desk buzzed. He hesitated before answering. "Raymond?" The voice on the other end said. It was his superior, the head of the State Judicial Committee. "We need to talk." "I know," Carter said, his voice tight. "I messed up." "That's putting it lightly," the man replied. "The Chief Justice has every right to call for an ethics review on you." Carter gripped the phone tighter. "Is she going to?" There was a pause. "Not yet, but she's watching, and so is everyone else." Carter leaned back, running a hand over his face. He knew what that meant. His every move was under scrutiny. Now, one more misstep, and he was done. The man on the phone sighed. "You need to fix this. Fast." When the call ended, Carter sat there, staring at his reflection in the window. He had spent years holding power over others, deciding their fates with the stroke of a pen. But for the first time, he realized his fate wasn't in his hands anymore. A few days later, Jordan and his mom sat in a quiet cafe, waiting. The nerves in his stomach twisted into knots. He had no idea what to expect. Then the door opened, and Margaret Holloway walked in. She was older than he had thought, maybe in her late 50s. Her hair was streaked with silver, and she carried herself with quiet grace. She spotted them immediately and smiled, making her way over. "Jordan," she said warmly, "and you must be his mother." His mom gave a polite nod, her guard still up. "That's right, I wanted to be here to make sure my son isn't walking into anything he shouldn't." Margaret smiled. "I respect that." She sat down and folded her hands on the table. "I know this must feel sudden, and I understand your hesitation, but let me explain why I'm doing this." Jordan listened closely as she spoke about her son Daniel, how he had been kind-hearted, just like Jordan, how he had always dreamed of making a difference, and how one night everything changed. She didn't go into details, but Jordan could hear the pain in her voice when she spoke of losing him. "I started this scholarship in his memory," she said softly, "to help young men like him. Young men with potential but not enough resources. I can't bring him back, but I can make sure his dream lives on through others." Jordan's mom finally spoke, her voice careful. "And you really think Jordan is the right person?" Margaret smiled at Jordan. "I don't just think, I know." Jordan's heart pounded. He didn't know what he had done to deserve this. He had never had someone believe in him like this before. Margaret reached into her bag and slid an envelope across the table. "Inside is everything you need to apply formally. If you choose to accept, you'll have full tuition covered. No strings attached." Jordan hesitated before picking it up. He looked at his mom, searching her face for an answer. She sighed, then gave him a small nod. "It's your decision, baby." Jordan turned back to Margaret. His fingers tightened around the envelope. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This was the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice, and deep down, he knew he had to take it. Jordan carried the envelope with him everywhere. He hadn't opened it yet, but just knowing it was there made everything feel different. It was strange. One small act of kindness had led to something life-changing, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that it was too good to be true. Every time he thought about accepting, doubt crept in. What if he wasn't the right person for this? What if he let Margaret down? His mom told him to trust himself, but even she seemed nervous. "Opportunities like this don't come easy," she reminded him, "but you gotta make sure it's what you really want." At school, Jordan barely paid attention in class. His best friend Malik noticed right away. "Yo, what's up with you, man?" Malik asked during lunch. "You been quiet all day." Jordan hesitated before pulling out the envelope. "Remember that lady on the train?" Malik's eyebrows shot up. "The pregnant one?" Jordan nodded. "She gave me this." Malik took the envelope and turned it over in his hands. "What is this?" Jordan sighed. "A scholarship. Full ride." Malik's eyes widened. "Bruh, are you serious?" "Yeah." Malik shook his head in disbelief. "And you ain't jumped on that yet? You know how many people would kill for this?" Jordan ran a hand over his face. "I know, man, it's just, I don't get why she picked me." Malik smirked. "Because you're a good dude." She saw that. Jordan wanted to believe that, but something still nagged at him. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Carter was spiraling. The story of his courtroom mistake hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown bigger. News outlets kept running the footage of him dismissing Justice Mitchell, and the internet was relentless. Every day, new articles picked apart his record, questioning how many other times he had let his biases rule the courtroom. He had spent his whole career controlling people's fates, and now his own was slipping out of his hands. The Judicial Committee was watching him closely, waiting for him to slip up again. One wrong move, and he could lose everything. And worst of all, Elaine Mitchell hadn't said a word to him since that day in court. She didn't have to. The silence was worse than anything she could have said. That's why, when he received a formal notice that she wanted to meet with him privately, his stomach twisted into knots. He wasn't sure if this was his chance to fix things or if it was already too late. A few nights later, Jordan finally made up his mind. He called Margaret. "I want to accept," he said. Margaret's voice lit up. "I'm so happy to hear that, Jordan. I knew you would." She invited him and his mother to her house that weekend for a formal meeting. "I want you to understand exactly what this scholarship means, and I want you to see for yourself why I chose you." Jordan agreed, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he understood. The night before the meeting, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He thought about Daniel, Margaret's son. He thought about how she had said he reminded her of him. But why? What was it about Jordan that made her so sure? Across town, Judge Carter sat across from Elaine Mitchell in her private office. The room was silent, the air thick with unspoken words. Elaine leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Tell me something, Judge Carter," she said finally. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" Carter exhaled. "I judged you before I even knew who you were." Elaine nodded slowly. "And how many others do you think you've done that to?" Carter looked away. He didn't have an answer. Elaine leaned forward. "I could call for an ethics review. I could push to have you removed from the bench." Carter's throat tightened. "Are you going to?" Elaine studied him for a long moment before saying, "I haven't decided yet." Carter swallowed hard. "I want you to do something for me," she continued. "I want you to go back through your past cases, look at the people you dismissed, the people you underestimated, and I want you to ask yourself if you were truly fair to them." Carter clenched his jaw. "And if I find that I wasn't," Elaine's voice was firm, "then you make it right." The words hit Carter harder than he expected. For the first time in his career, he had to face the possibility that he had been wrong. And if he had been wrong before, how many lives had he affected because of it? The weight of it was unbearable. That weekend, Jordan and his mom arrived at Margaret's house. It was bigger than he expected, but warm and welcoming. Margaret greeted them at the door, ushering them inside. "I want to show you something," she said, leading them to a room at the back of the house. The room was filled with photographs, pictures of a young man. Daniel Jordan stared at the images, his breath catching in his throat. Daniel looked like him, not just a little, a lot. He turned to Margaret in shock. "What?" Margaret's eyes were filled with emotion. "I never told you this, Jordan, but my son, he was adopted." Jordan's heart pounded. "He never got to meet his birth family," Margaret continued, "but I always told him that wherever they were, they must have been good people, because he was the best person I ever knew." Jordan couldn't breathe. Margaret's voice softened. "Jordan, I believe you and Daniel were connected in a way neither of us ever expected." His mother gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Jordan felt the world tilt around him. Everything suddenly made sense. The way Margaret had looked at him, the way she had chosen him so quickly, and in that moment he realized this was more than just a scholarship. This was something much, much bigger.